Anyone can do a time lapse. The problem is, can you do a time lapse correctly? My name is Noe and I sell time lapse professionally to TV stations and movies. I've even been on National Geographic, and I think I am pretty qualified to teach you guys how to create time lapse professionally. Now let's get one thing out of the way first. First of all, there's two different kinds of time lapse. One is made by speeding up the video, and to be honest, it doesn't look so good. I mean, it's an easy way to do it and anyone can do it, but actually the time lapse itself does not look very professional. So what we're going to be doing today is we're going to be shooting stills and turning that into a time lapse, because stills, you can actually manipulate many factors. It looks a lot smoother, and in post-production you can actually make it look much better. So usually gear is not so important when it comes to photography. When it comes to time lapse, it is and can be quite important, especially if you want a professional looking time lapse. Most importantly, you're going to need a tripod. That should be a given in any photographer's arsenal. You're going to need an intervalometer. Now these cost anywhere from $10 to $20. You can get them on Amazon or eBay or pretty much any photo store. Different camera brands have different intervalometers. Some cameras don't need an intervalometer. I know Sony cameras usually have an inbuilt intervalometer, but Canon sells them separately. So depending on your camera brand, you might have to buy an intervalometer or you might not. Next, you're going to need, and most importantly, you're going to need a camera of some sort, whether it be a DSLR or a mirrorless camera. It's actually easier to do with a mirrorless camera than a DSLR, but I'm going to go over the differences. And you're going to need an ND filter depending on the time of the day that you're shooting. Now, the reason you need an ND filter is because when I look at time-lapse footage, either it's very choppy and amateurish, that means people are just kind of flying in and out of the frame, or it can be very smooth and it just flows very nicely. It's hard to explain, but you can see it very clearly. When you shoot with an ND filter, you can use lower shutter speeds during the daytime. But if you shoot with a faster shutter speed without an ND filter, you're going to be having very choppy footage. And maybe for you guys, you don't notice the difference, but me as a professional, I notice this right away. So please get an ND filter depending on the time of the day. If you're shooting at night, you won't really need it. But if you're shooting in the daytime, you will definitely need an ND filter for a professional looking time lapse. So let's go back to talking about gear. And this is actually very important because when we do time lapse, there's this phenomenon called flicker. So most amateur time lapsers don't notice this, but it stands out like day and night to me. And usually when I sell time lapse to movie stations, if there is some sort of flicker in the footage, they will not accept it. And here is how flicker is caused. When you create a time lapse with a DSLR, for example, what happens is that every time that the camera takes a picture, the aperture widens up so you can see through the mirror, and then it will close down to take the picture. Now, you would think that every time it takes a picture, it has the exact same f-stop. For example, you're shooting at f8, it always closes to f8. But that is not exactly correct because there's very small fluctuations between each picture. So what happens is when you're doing a time lapse with a DSLR camera, sometimes one picture is just a little bit brighter or a little bit darker than the previous picture. And when you put this time lapse together, you get flicker in your footage. Now, I know most of you won't notice that and probably won't care, but if you want to do a time lapse correctly, professionally, you will care. Now, you might ask yourself, how can I get rid of flicker? Now, you can use software to get rid of flicker, but actually that doesn't always work and the software is expensive. There's two ways to get rid of flicker completely. First method is to shoot with a manual lens. So if you use those old manual lenses, they don't have electronic contacts. And when you take a picture, the aperture stays the same. It doesn't change at all. So there won't be any changes in exposure between each picture. That's one of the best ways to do it. The second method of preventing flicker is actually the lens twist method. Now it is a little tricky and it is kind of risky, but actually I've been doing this for years and I've never had a problem. The way you do the lens twist method is you're going to have to hold down the depth of field preview button on your camera. So what that happens is the aperture is going to open up. And then to prevent the aperture from closing and resetting, you're actually going to have to unscrew the lens, but you're not going to take off the lens. You're just trying to do it so that the electronic contacts are not touching with the camera. So when you do this, the aperture stays consistent. It's not going to open or close between shots. And what that's going to do is going to prevent flicker. Now there is a third way to prevent flicker, and this is not always consistent because it differs between cameras. But if you're using a mirrorless camera, I've noticed that most mirrorless cameras, the aperture stays the same and there isn't flicker in the footage. But if you notice that your mirrorless time-lapse has flicker, then you might want to consider trying what I told you or using a manual lens. Next, let's talk about shutter speed. So you have your camera ready, and people always ask, should I shoot in aperture priority mode? And as a professional, I tell you, no, don't shoot in aperture priority mode. I want you to shoot in manual mode. So you're going to expose for the scene. Now, if you're doing something like a sundown or sunrise, there are ways to change the exposure over time manually, and I'm going to do a separate video about that. But for now, let's imagine you're doing a regular time lapse and you're going to shoot in manual mode. So you're going to set your picture, you're going to set your exposure however you want it. Typically, you want the ISO as low as possible. Depending on how much bokeh or not you want in the scene, you're probably going to be shooting at f8 or higher. And when it comes to the shutter speed, and this is the important part, you're going to be wanting to shoot at a shutter speed of 1 second or somewhere around 1 second. Now this is very important because you want your time lapse to flow. So you want to take pictures that have a little bit of blur, a little bit of movement in them. That way when you play back the time lapse video, everything just smooths out like ebb and flow. If you use a high shutter speed, like 1/60th of a second, then your time lapse is going to come out kind of choppy. The people are going to move very unnaturally. And if you're an amateur, you're just going to think, wow, I did a time lapse, it looks great. But if you're a professional, this kind of thing stands out as clear as night and day. So you're going to want to be using a low shutter speed. And that's why earlier I told you guys, if you're shooting in the daytime, you're going to need an ND filter. Now there are exceptions to this. For example, if you're shooting a landscape and there's no people or movement directly in front of the lens, then it's okay because you're just focusing on nature and you're focusing on the clouds, and the movement is so slow that you don't really notice it. However, if you're using a time lapse for people or for cars or for anything directly in the vicinity, then you should use an ND filter. I mean, you can do the time lapse without the ND filter, but remember, this is making a time lapse professionally. So settings, ISO 100, as low as possible. Aperture, f8 or above. Shutter speed should be anywhere around the area of 1 second. So these settings are not going to be exactly correct for you, but you're going to want a low ISO. You're going to want a shutter speed of a second or around a second for sure. And your aperture should be higher than f8, even if you're using an ND filter. So I will leave the correct exposure to you guys, but you should keep the ISO and the shutter speed at what I told you. Now, if you're doing clouds and stuff like that, then the shutter speed doesn't matter so much. But if you're doing people or movement in front of you, you're going to want a shutter speed of about 1 second. So next is the interval, or how much time should you take between each picture. And I'm going to give you a general guidelines. I mean, you don't have to do this. This is just what I typically do. When I'm doing a time lapse of people, of driving, or of cars moving, or something in front of the lens nearby, I like to keep the interval at 1 second. That means I take one picture, I wait 1 second, and I take another picture, and I just keep it at that. If I'm doing landscapes and there's fast moving clouds in the sky, I typically shoot at an interval of about 3 seconds. However, if the clouds are moving relatively slow, then I usually keep the interval at about 10 seconds. So I'll shoot a picture 10 seconds later, I'll take another picture. For sunrise or sunsets, I keep it anywhere between 10 and 15 seconds, usually around 12 seconds. And when I'm shooting stars, I keep it anywhere from 15 seconds to 30 seconds. Normally, I just do about 20 seconds. So the last thing we need to talk about are the frame rates, because when you put your pictures into the computer, you need a good frame rate. If you're doing 10 pictures per second as a video or as a movie, your time lapse is going to be very, very choppy. Actually, anything under 20 seconds is going to look very choppy and amateurish. I typically shoot my time lapses anywhere between 24 pictures per second or 30 pictures per second. It's really up to you. So that usually means I shoot about 168 pictures or sometimes up to 200 pictures per time-lapse section. That gives me at least around 7 or 8 seconds of time-lapse footage. So now that I've gone over all the technicalities of shooting a time-lapse, let's put it all together and I'm going to show you guys exactly how I do my time-lapse. First of all, I set my tripod, I set my camera. Next, I would compose the picture how I would like it to be. Now, first you have to compose your picture because next we're going to put the ND filter on our camera. So after our ND filter is on the camera, we have to figure out the exposure. Here is where you're gonna play around with settings and try to get a perfectly balanced photo. So my ISO is 100. My shutter speed should be about a second if I'm taking pictures of people, and it doesn't really matter so much if I'm taking pictures of clouds. So if you're taking pictures of clouds, you don't need the ND filter. Once I have these settings set, I set my aperture to get the exposure that I need. Typically, it's anywhere between f8 or f11 or above. So once I have set my exposure, I hold down the depth of field button and I unscrew my lens so that I don't get any flicker in my photos. That's if I'm shooting with a DSLR. Sometimes I'll use a manual lens and I don't have to worry about flicker. But like I said, if you're using a DSLR, you're probably going to be worried about flicker. So either use a manual lens or do the lens screw method. Now, if you're using a mirrorless camera, you might not have to worry about this, but it does vary between mirrorless cameras. So if you notice you're getting flicker, you might have to do either of these. So once I finish preparing my time lapse, now I set my interval. Like I said, for people, I usually do 1 second. Same thing for traffic and same thing for driving. If I want to do fast moving clouds, I'll do 1 picture every 3 seconds. If I'm doing slow moving clouds, I'll do 1 picture every 10 seconds. If I'm doing sunrises or sunsets, I'll do anywhere between 12 and 15 seconds. Finally, if I'm doing a time lapse of the stars, I'll do about 20 seconds, but you can go as high as once every 30 seconds. Now, next step comes post-production, and I'm actually going to make a separate video about post-production. Also, if you guys are interested in hyperlapse, I will be making tutorials on hyperlapse videos, but this is an essential first. First, you need to know how to do a time lapse before you can do a hyperlapse. So, thanks for watching this video. Please leave a comment. If you're having any trouble, any problems, let me know. I will help you. And actually, I have a really old video about how to do a time lapse. If you're interested in watching it, I'll put the link below, but it's really old. The audio is bad. That's why I remade this video and I updated it. So thank you very much, and I'll see you next time.